Hello and welcome. You found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. Hey there, podcast listeners. Jonathan here. In today's episode, I talked to Erlene Grise-Owens, Justin J. Miller, and Mindy Eaves, the editor of the A-to-Z Self-Care Handbook for Social Workers and Other Helping Professionals, published by the New Social Worker Press. Now, in the next 47 minutes, we will unveil the 4-minute solution to coworker conflict, the 2-week detox that will free you of aches and pains, and the 5,000-year-old mantra that helped me land my very own podcast series. I'm totally kidding. The next time you see one of those self-care headlines, just pull out your magic decoder ring and see the message underneath. A fool and their money are soon parted. And for you grammarians, that was an intentionally gender-inclusive use of the word there. The self-help industry wants you to think that self-care can be quick and easy if only you buy their book or their product. But it isn't. Now, it isn't impossible either, and that's what we talk about in today's episode. My guests debunk some of the self-care myths, and they share some of the guidelines about making self-care a practice. One of the things I loved about this interview is that you can hear Erlene, Jay, and Mindy modeling one of the essential components of self-care: finding a community and support network. They have a great time with each other. They finish each other's sentences, tease each other, and support each other, all on the podcast. So my guests not only talk about what self-care is and is not, but they model it. So we talk about SMART self-care plans, S-M-A-R-T, and you'll learn about what that is. We talk about how being active is not the same as being athletic, about how personal self-care requires professional self-care, and how professional self-care affects organizational wellness, and how organizational wellness affects professional self-care. Now, Dr. Erlene Grise-Owens is partner in the Wellness Group. Justin J. Miller is an assistant professor at the College of Social Work at the University of Kentucky, and Mindy Eaves is the founding ombudsman for Jefferson County Public Schools, which is the 26th largest school district in the United States. If you want to learn more about the myriad of things that each of these fine people do, check out their bios on socialworkpodcast.com. If you like what you hear, check out their book, A-to-Z Self-Care Handbook for Social Workers and Other Helping Professionals, published by the New Social Worker Press. And if you want a deeper dive into self-care, Erlene and Jay are doing a 2-part webinar for the New Social Worker magazine called Self-Care Well Shop: Foundations and Fundamentals on March 21st, 2018 and April 18th, 2018. And there's a link on socialworkpodcast.com. If you want to transcribe this or any other episode, please send me an email, and I'll gladly take you up on your generosity. Crowdsourcing transcripts is one of the ways you help me take care of myself. And in the spirit of self-care, I'd like to give a big shout out to some folks who have generously donated their time to transcribe episodes, some of which are recent, and others are further back in the archives. Anastasia Jenkins, MSW from Dallas, Texas. Kendra Wagner, MSW, American Association of Suicidology Certified Crisis Counselor and Forensic Specialist. Cassie Griffith, MSW, Case Manager, JUF Uptown Cafe and Ezra Multi-Level Service. Dedrick Perkins, University of Oklahoma's Ann and Henry Zarrow School of Social Work. Meredith Amshoff, who's an MSW graduate of Boston College, who's working for Catholic Relief Services in Kampala, Uganda, and Esther Park, an aspiring clinical and school social worker from New Jersey. Thanks, y'all, for making the Social Work Podcast a better resource. And now, without further ado, on to episode 118 of the Social Work Podcast, Self-Care for Social Workers, an interview with Erlene Grise-Owens, Justin J. Miller, and Mindy Eaves. Well, thank you all so much for being here on the Social Work Podcast and talking with us about self-care. So what should people do to take care of themselves, to really sort of do self-care right?
and we get this question all the time, folks want us to tell them what to do for self-care. And on its face, we just totally reject that notion. If I had a self-care pill to give to everybody, I would do that. But because we don't, and perhaps sell it. But because we don't, we really try to, there are some common themes. There are some kind of universal pillars that people can adopt related to self-care. But outside of those, folks have to come to what self-care is for themselves. They have to think about what works for them and their families and their situations, what's actually calming to them or works for them. Erlene and I joke all the time. Erlene's really big into yoga. Yoga does nothing for me. I just fall asleep and take naps.
It would. If you only did it, that would be, yeah.
But that speaks to the notion of like, we are very different people with very different personalities, with very different families and lifestyles. And so I find self-care practices that are conducive to things going on in my life. And I think that's what everyone should try to do. But we have to totally reconceptualize and reframe this notion of there is a prescription that I can give you, and if you go do this, you will be well. Or you will be practicing self-care. Again, there are components that people can learn. It's certainly a skill that people can develop. But outside of that framework, you have to fill in the framework with what works for you.
So what is that framework?
It's a lifestyle. One of many myths about self-care is, like Jay said, there's a self-care plan. And there is not a self-care plan. Not even my self-care plan now at in my point in life is not the same self-care plan that I had when I was in my 30s or 40s or at a different point in my life. So it's what is your lifestyle and how can you integrate self-care into that lifestyle. So it's not something you do after work. It's something you do during work. It's how you do your work. And so being really one of the hardest things, or one of the things that happens a lot, is that when people first start doing self-care, is they try to do someone else's self-care plan. Right. That is almost universally the mistake that people make. So Jay is an athlete.
Yeah, he looks like an athlete.
He's an athlete. I am not an athlete. So we serve as self-care support groups. So when CrossFit first came out, I said to Jay, who has tried to work with me on fitness because we have that kind of relationship. So I said to Jay, hey, this new CrossFit thing, do you think that's something that I could do? He looked at me and he said, nope. So one of the things in self-care is saving time and having critical friends that you can depend on to keep you accountable. So because I joked, I said, he just saved a lot of time. He would have had to come see me in the hospital.
Which would have cut into my self-care plan.
Medical bills would have cut into, the college fund for his kids. So really being very intentional and very aware. I am in my self-care plan, I strive to be active, not athletic. And for many years, I thought that the way to have good physical self-care, it was to be an athlete. And I wasn't an athlete, so I was constantly failing. So to identify who you are, what works for you, and make it a part of your lifestyle.
And to know, self-care is not a destination. It is a journey. It is a process.
Right.
So Erlene could have went and tried CrossFit and would have found out very early that this is not self-care for me. And she could have conceptualized that as, this self-care thing doesn't work. I tried it and it's no good. So it's a journey, and you're going to try things. Maybe one day I'll try yoga that works and that doesn't work. But because if you view it as a process, again, as a skill, when social work students are learning assessment skills or interview skills, there are times when they may make missteps or mistakes or say things that they didn't mean to say or do things they didn't mean to do. Self-care is the same way. You're going to go try something and say, that didn't work, or I really didn't see the point in this. And it doesn't mean you stop doing it. You don't stop learning assessment. You just retool and learn it a different way. Self-care is the exact same thing. So it's important that people try to see it that way.
So, Mindy, you've been sitting over here sort of quietly, but I can see you've got things that you want to say about this. What is it that you think that students and practitioners should know?
Right. Well, the plan is a living plan. So, of course, it does change depending on if you try CrossFit and it doesn't work for you, or if you try yoga and it doesn't work for you. My self-care, I love to spend time in nature, and I garden a lot. I do it with my daughter. So being a single mother, a career mother, I always feel bad, really, about not having that time. And so when I'm out gardening, she can do it with me. And so I'm spending that time with her. I'm feeling good about that. Those feelings of guilt that single mothers get, single career mothers get, I kind of deal with that by spending that time with her. And it just feels really good to be connected to the earth and to garden. When it comes to self-care for, practitioners and students, is that it's about sustainability. And if you want to sustain in this work, then self-care really isn't an option. It has not been an option for me.
I mean, it's not an option not to.
It's not an option.
Optional.
Yeah, it's
essential.
It's essential. Thank you. Yes, it's essential. So if you want to sustain and practice, we're working with folks that have experienced all types of trauma, and day in and day out, we're kind of running in the places that folks run out of. Last year at the plenary, Dr. Jackson said, the opening plenary, he said, that you all have to go in places where nobody else wants to go, and he's talking about all those challenges of vicarious trauma, burnout, and professional depletion. And so how do we sustain in doing that work? And it's like taking an intentional approach to it, and also it helps in terms of our work with other people because we're modeling that. So as practitioners, we're modeling that for our clients. If we're educators, we're modeling that for our students. And that's really one of the best ways is to teach, is to model it yourself. And if we really want to change this landscape in social work where professional depletion and trauma and like you said, Erlene, it's a badge of honor, right? It's a badge of honor to burn out. Well, is that really sustainable? Is that really what we want for social work, is for us to burn out? Because really we need people that stay in it, that practice, that teach, and then go on to be lobbyists because they understand all this work. But if they're burning out, they're leaving. So we want them to stay. And so self-care is a component, of sustaining and being competent.
So one of the myths is that burnout is a badge of honor. Are there other myths about self-care that you think are important for people to know about?
Yeah, I think that there's some myths. As a social worker, I work as an ombudsman, though, but social work is my foundation.
What is an ombudsman?
Yeah, so an ombudsman, I'm an ombudsman for the school district, and basically I help folks handle very sensitive matters off the record as a neutral. So I'm hired to be a neutral, and anyone can come to me, whether it's a substitute teacher or if it's an administrator who works in the area of equity. All of them can come to me about their concerns, and it stays off the record. So it's a trusted person who's typically a good listener, who understands policy. Well, who's that? Social workers, right? That's what we are. And so they come to talk to me about their concerns, but I do it in a PK through 12 environment. And so in terms of myths, I think that a lot of other helping professions don't explicitly talk about self-care or see themselves as a helping profession and being impacted by some of the things that we've been talking about. And so our book, it says, it's for and other helping professionals. So in the PK-12 environment, a lot of teachers suffer from some of the very same things that social workers do. And it makes sense, right? Because they're right there with those students. Those students, that we're working with in their homes and with their families, they're coming to school with all of those issues and still trying to engage them and educate them, and then not having really the skill set, at least, or haven't worked on that in in school to develop those skills. And so it's a myth that other folks don't suffer from some of these things, and we need to talk about it. And so one of the things that I do is we all do workshops on self-care, but I really try to get them just to understand that this is them too. It's kind of a myth that, well, that's, the social workers. No, you actually struggle with it too. Are you dealing with this? And I'll go through the list. They're not sleeping. They're having dreams, things like that. Well, guess what? You're suffering from maybe secondary trauma. Let's talk about it and what you can do to take care of yourself.
I think two of the big ones that we often get questions about is, the first myth is that self-care is selfish, and it is not. And I think the second one is that self-care is something extra. And again, it isn't. It should be something that is integrated into your everyday practice. It's not something that is ancillary or something that you should have to take on in addition to your work. It should be part of your work. And quite frankly, I think it's probably selfish to not engage in self-care, because I can't fathom. I think we've done some research that shows that people who are practicing self-care are better practitioners for their clients. And so again, to me, it just runs counter to think that, well, if I do more and I burn out, I'm somehow serving my clients better. You may be putting in more hours, but I would argue that those hours are probably not the quality ones that you should otherwise be putting in. We've tried to do some work around reconceptualizing the way that we think about self-care. It's not selfish. It's not ancillary. It's not something extra that you do, and that it is a skill that can be practiced. So we're on this journey with everyone else. So, we'll probably leave here and go downstairs and start talking about, okay, we got to think about this or think about that, because to us, this is a journey. This is not it's not a destination. And so we're going to continue to grapple with and celebrate self-care concepts, and we hope that we can continue to do work to help people do the same.
I've actually had other social workers say, well, that self-care thing, that's nice, but it's kind of a privilege, isn't it, to participate in self-care? And I respond to them. Audre Lorde, who's a radical feminist shero of mine, said self-care is radical practice. And that as social workers, particularly because we are working with folks, and we ourselves oftentimes who enter the profession are in marginalized groups. And so there's that layer of cultural stress and layered onto our professional stress. And then, of course, most of us who are in social work or in helping professionals are the identified go-to person in our families around the caretaker. So the importance of practicing radical self-care, and that's what I've started framing it as, is it's not I'm going to go get a massage, which I love massages too, by the way.
Me too.
It's part of my yoga and massage instead of CrossFit. So it's all of those things. But taking a radical approach, I think, is necessary. I've become more and more convinced of that, because it's not going to work sustainably, as Mindy said, to just kind of dabble in it. Absolutely. It is so counter to what we have been immersed in that it really requires being radical about it. And doing things like, I will put self-care appointments on my calendar. I put yoga classes on my calendar before I put anything else, because I know that it's too tempting for other things to squeeze in.
So you're prioritizing your self-care by scheduling it first.
Right. And that's a good way of thinking about it in terms of what are my priorities. And as Jay said, what I've learned in my decades of doing this is when I'm doing it well, or at least good enough, I'm a much better practitioner because of taking care of myself. I'm sharper, I'm better able to sustain my work and stay in the profession in a very meaningful way. It's not just doing it to survive. It's really, I love this profession. And part of why I've been able to sustain that love for the profession, and I consider it a pleasure and a joy to do the work that I do. And that isn't because it's easy or because I've always had worked in non-toxic environments, because a lot of the environments we work in are toxic. And but it's having that radical approach to self-care that has helped me remain not just in the profession, but really joyful about being in the profession.
All right, so I see you shaking your head about this radical thing.
Yeah, I just want to say, while I certainly think it's necessary to think of it in that way, I think it's also very sad. It's a very sad reflection of our profession that we would think about having to take care of oneself as being radical. And I think that, as educators and as practitioners, we always strive to adhere to codes of ethics. And I think the interesting thing is that those codes speak to the notion that self-care is a part of ethical social work practice. You look at NASW, I think, in 2008 or 9, put out a statement about professional self-care. You look at IFSW, you look at NABSW, you look at NACSW. All of those codes speak to this notion of you must take care of yourself to provide adept, competent service to practitioners. And so, again, if that is indeed the case, I just find it both sad, perplexing, and refreshing all at the same time that we have to think about this or convince people. If for no other reason, if you don't find value in taking care of yourself, if you don't find value in making the time, if for no other reason, but it's the ethical thing to do, one should seek to engage in self-care practice.
I also think, having been in social work education for a couple of decades, that it is unethical for schools of social work or for programs to not prepare students in the arena of self-care, to not make that part of that curriculum, because we are putting students out there. We're putting new graduates out into the field, and part of our ethical obligation, and in terms of competence, in terms of practicing as a professional, is to for them to be prepared to do that. And a core part of being prepared to do competent practice, to do ethical practice, is to know how to do self-care. And so there are specific things that can be taught. And one of the things that we've used in our curriculum for several years is every student has to design a self-care plan. And then throughout the curriculum, there are check-in points, and they have accountability partners. So, and we have a format that has the areas of emotional, social, professional, and academic and professional, personal, or what are the psychological?
Yeah, psychological, physical, social, and professional care.
Yeah, and so so having a structure and being attentive to all of those areas, and then spiritual can be incorporated into any of those areas. And they design, and we encourage folks to think of it in terms of the Drucker came up with the terminology of SMART: specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time limited. Because oftentimes what we start out with, and I talk about it in terms of redefining success, like I was saying earlier about my brief foray into CrossFit, where Jay said, just say no.
I was going to have the CrossFit Foundation try and sponsor this episode. That's not going to happen now.
Well, that was not smart. That would not have been a smart self-care plan for me. Instead, a smart self-care plan for me is my pedometer, so that I can specifically measure if I have a goal. I started out with a goal of 10,000 steps. I did a baseline, And I wasn't meeting that. So I could have felt like a failure. But if I reassessed, and I made it smart by being realistic, the R part of it was to be realistic. I started out with trying to attain 5,000 steps a day, and then over time have ratcheted that up as I've been able to do that. So oftentimes people will start out with things like, I'm going to take better care of myself. Right. That's my self-care plan. That's an example of not smart. So to be specifically, how many, like somebody might say, I'm going to take breaks at work. So that's a good movement toward being smart, but even to be more specific of, I'm going to take 2 15-minute breaks, or I'm going to make it really where if I came in, I could observe, or there would be there would be a way of assessing that.
And you really have to kind of, I think, in that notion, you have to stick to the plan, you have to work the plan, and you have to know that you're not going to hit all of the metrics that you have there. So you have to revisit. And I think the commitment piece is making a commitment to taking care of oneself or engaging in self-care is huge. And there are times when it impacts my self-care, because I'll call Erlene and I'll say, hey, this is a really important thing. We got to finish up this project. I need to meet, and let's meet Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock. And she's like, nope, I got my self-care day today, or I'm doing yoga, or I'm taking a walk. I'm like, but we got this stuff. She's like, no, I'm going to take a walk. And it speaks to this level
of... We can talk about it while we walk.
It speaks to this level of commitment that you have to have. And then two, the component of having a self-care partner or an accountability group. Again, I think the CrossFit is but one example of where we have tried to work to have this a self-care accountability group whereby we're often checking in. How are you doing with this, and how are you doing with that? And it helps us to assess if something is going to be realistic or not. I may have some scholarship goals that I may set for myself for a year, and I'll talk to Erlene, and I'm sometimes not being realistic about what I'm going to be able to get done. And so it's good to have people around you who are honest and authentic and who can help you along in that self-care plan, just like any other arena of your social work practice.
Well, we talk about professional care, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier. As practitioners, we have CEUs, and it's time limited. You have to have them by a certain period of time based on whenever you got your license. And what I have found, and others, is that we're kind of rushing to get our hours at the very last minute because we've put ourselves second. We focused on our organization. We focused on making sure we're doing the documenting. We focused on making sure, whatever it is that we need to do for our clients. But our CEUs are about sharpening ourselves, right? We're our greatest tool, our best tool. And if you're really taking time, you really want to go to your ethics class, your ethics CEU, and then look at what you're doing currently and make changes or celebrate what you're doing well. And if you're rushing at the very last minute, then it's more about just getting the CEUs as opposed to actually sharpening your tool, which is yourself and your knowledge. And I know that a lot of people don't look at professional care as a component of self-care, but it is. In my office, another way in terms of professional care is what I have in my office. We've struggled with, over the years, do you have pictures of your family or not in your office? And I guess it's different for every person in the work that you do. For me, it's a big yes. I do have pictures of my family there. I have a plant and pictures of nature because, that's what really soothes me. And so it's something that you can really do. So if you're listening to this podcast, take a look at, your space, your work workspace. Is it stressful? Does it bring stress to you? Does it bring happiness? Is it soothing? Do you have access to music? Do you have plants or a fountain or pictures of your family or some folks like accessories? Do you have that on your wall and that's motivating? And so, it is going to yoga. It is doing CrossFit or not. And it's also putting your professional care first. So you really are taking advantage of, the CEUs that are out there for you, and you're not just getting the hours, because that's not the point. The hours aren't the point. Sharpening your skills is the point.
Well, and it sounds like there's one of the things that I'm picking up is that it's important to have a plan, and you use the acronym SMART, right, to sort of figure out that it's attainable and measurable and all those sorts of things. But there's a meta level about actually going through that process and being conscious and intentional about things in general. Probably helps you to take care of yourself instead of just sort of sleepwalking through life. And professionally, we sleepwalk through until a month before our CEUs are ready, and then we're like, oh my God, I've got to get this done. The other thing that you said that I thought was really interesting was about your environment, not just external, like outside the office, but also inside the office. And it reminds me about the importance of self-care in an organizational context. Can you guys talk about self-care, the relationship between, a student intern or a professional and their organization, and maybe what the organizational responsibility is in supporting social workers to take care of themselves?
Sure. Part of the work that we do is working with organizations and doing consultations with organizations around organizational wellness. And the way that we frame self-care and wellness is that self-care is a component that affects organizational wellness, and organizations affect self-care. But one of the myths is that practitioners think, well, if my organization would be better, I could be better.
Right, like I'm in a really dysfunctional organization, so how could I possibly take care of myself?
Exactly, and that is a huge myth, because if we wait until the organization changes, we'll be waiting a long time. And part of changing the organization, one of the things that social workers are really good at is doing systems thinking. And so that's the way to frame it, is that systemically, if I make a change in my own self-care, I am making a change in the organization. And there are lots of things that organizations can and should do to promote practitioner well-being and to promote the health of the organization. And there are things that we as practitioners can do in terms of self-care that even if the organization does nothing, we will change how we are practicing, and that changes the way that we experience our work, the way we're able to sustain our work. So yes, organizational wellness is really an important topic and an important aspect of this. I just want to caution us all to not fall into the myth of if it's up to the organization that I can't do something myself.
So I think that there's something important about this, which is that my field of suicide in kids, there are times where things happen and organizations can be responsive. And that can help folks in terms of this burnout. And it might not be sort of the long-term self-care plan, but there are things organizations can and should do to be supportive of employees so that they can engage in their self-care.
Yeah, and it we've done several projects and written papers around thinking about and conceptualizing organizational wellness, and I think the literature is very clear that social service organizations do not do a good job at this. A lot of the literature is concentrated in the business realm, and I think again I try to be a rational person, and I always like to present people with this is why you should do something. And as leaders of organizations, to me, it makes sense to say, I want to put my employees in a position to be the most efficient, productive people that they can be. And again, when you think about it in that mind, the research is very clear that when folks participate in wellness initiatives, from simply handing out literature to these very rigorous, active, multi-layered initiatives, you have better outcomes. Your employees do better. They perform better. They stick around longer. Retention and recruitment is a huge issue. And what we're starting to see is that, as the self-care thing continues to grow and we continue to engage it as a part of practice and students keep thinking about it and working on it, we're going to start to see where, and I would encourage students to think about when you're going to work at an agency, there are a multitude of different factors you need to take into account, how much you're going to get paid, et cetera, et cetera. But you also need to think about the wellness, or how will this organization help me practice my self-care? What kind of wellness initiatives do they have? Do they allow my family to be involved in different things and outings? And what the environment looks like where I'm thinking about working. And again, when you think about it in those terms, no matter what you personally may think about self-care, it just makes the most sense to do that. And I hope that, and we hope that organizations become more responsive to that. But again, to Erlene's point, it does not mean that if your organization does not do self-care well, that you get off the hook, or that's an excuse for you to not do it. You got to keep doing it.
Well, and many folks who start out with their own self-care plan, their own attention to self-care, then that reverberates out into the team, which then may reverberate out into the broader organization. And so you can also, we've talked with folks who, have gone to some of our workshops or are familiar with the work that we've done, and they've taken some of the materials, the book or the other materials, and to their organization. And you start it with your team. You start it with a coworker, and you say, this is something I want to commit to do. Will you be my accountability partner? And that, too, is how organizations begin to change. And as people with that perspective move into leadership roles, move into supervision roles, that's also how we're going to change the culture of the profession. I truly believe, I'm convinced of this, that in several years we can look back at the profession and we can say, wow, remember back when it was assumed that people would burn out? Look at how much the profession has changed in terms of who we are as a profession and how we know to take care of one another. I believe that's possible. And it starts with one self-care plan at a time, and can reverberate out into the organization, and really educating ourselves about the possibilities.
You didn't say this specifically, but as you were talking, I kind of got this impression of kind of a sea of yeses. Like somebody says, I'm going to take care of myself. And then somebody else is like, well, yes, I'm going to take care of myself. And then at an organizational level, the organization was like, yes, we support this. We're not exactly sure how that's going to, but yes, we're going to say yes to this idea. And it reminds me, my first job was at a crisis unit. I worked the 2 to 10 shift. And one night, I was sitting there eating dinner, and I had made some chicken thing, and I brought it in. And my coworker said, oh, that looks good. Can I have some? And I was like, sure. And she said, well, next time you make that, make enough for me, right? And, we're crisis workers, so we're like, ribbing each other all the time. And then I said, okay, well, if I make something for you, then you should make something for me. And so once a week, we would alternate making food for each other. And it turned into this really nice self-care thing that my then girlfriend was like, well, why are you cooking for her and you're not cooking for me? And so that inspired a date night kind of with my home. So it was a way of this sort of self-care that sort of started as a joke, but we said yes to it, and then we moved on. And it wasn't something that the organization did, but the organization didn't stop us from doing that at work.
Right.
Or at home.
We did a similar thing. So I worked, before becoming an ombudsman and a social work educator, I worked in child welfare for almost a decade. And as Jay mentioned earlier, high turnover and burnout in that area. And at the time, I didn't know it, and that was the landscape of child welfare. And so we just happened to be a lot of us students of Erlene, and we started doing self-care things. We didn't even call it self-care actually, but we did what you did. We started once a month, we would have breakfast, and we scheduled that time, and we brought breakfast, and for those 2 hours a month, that's what we did on a Friday, is that we had breakfast with one another, and it was on our team. And then another thing that we started to do in terms of professional care was we had what we called flex days, and all of us took flex days, and we knew each other's flex days, and so we made an agreement that whenever, like Jonathan, if you were on a flex day, that we would not we wouldn't call you on something that happened, something that happened on your case. We would take it. And so we then kind of got to know each other's cases, and then allowed that person, if like you, Jonathan, to be off and really carve out that time to do whatever it was that you wanted to do for yourself and not be impacted by what was happening at the office. Another thing that we did was we wanted to just, hang out together and go do something fun and go on a vacation together. We became friends, and also we were colleagues, but we became friends. And we would travel together. Vacation is, part of self-care. And so as I bring this back to organizational wellness, or what you can do even if the organization isn't doing it, is that eventually our supervisor took a look at our numbers and our outcomes were much better in that we had more reunifications, we had less disruptions in placements, and I do believe that is because we knew each other's cases, we supported each other, and we, to be honest, were a wonderful team. And to this day, I just remember her talking about those outcomes with our families in that particular zip code. And I do believe that it had a lot to do with the work that we did on that particular team. And those that weren't on board at first just kind of started doing it too. And it's so we didn't let the fact that 2 or 3 didn't want to do it stop us. And so it really can just one self-care plan at a time, 2 people to 3 people. Then it became a team, and then it truly did affect the outcomes for at least that particular zip code. So that was nice.
That's a great story.
Well, and 2, I think it speaks to this notion of a lot of times, and we find this a lot too, and we'll get a call from an agency or an organization, and we'll be working with them around organizational wellness, and we come in and we find that they're already doing a lot of stuff. There are already some wellness type things going on. And sometimes we'll just encourage them to kind of think about repackaging the things that they're already doing. Or it's amazing what adding a label, what saying, yes, the fact that you do walking meetings, that's a form of self-care. Let's put that in the plan. What does that look like? And so there's this synergistic kind of thing of getting people to thinking about, oh, well, I do engage in self-care. It's not this abstract construct that sits in a corner. It's something that I can touch and see and feel. And so it kind of demystifies the concept of I work from 9 to 5 and then I'll try to do self-care afterwards. And so again, for organizations or for folks who are moving into going to work at an organization, I would encourage them to think about what's already happening and how you can leverage that or build on that. And again, back to this notion of it doesn't have to be something extra. It is something that can be integrated, and a lot of times people are doing stuff already. So encouraging people to think about that is important.
Yeah, and taking the solution-focused approach to, like Jay was saying, what are you already doing, or what have you done in the past, and how can you leverage that to really make wellness and self-care even more effective. So as we were talking about this, a couple of things I wanted to add. One is that people do tend to overcomplicate it. And they tend to make it something that is, wow, I've got to do this self-care. And it's really, it's a skill, as we've been saying, and something to be developed. And it's a philosophy. It's how you approach your work. When we talk with organizations, we talk about how we encourage them to think about it as a lens, that everything you do in the organization, to look at it through the wellness lens, as a way of operating, not as something that you do as an initiative that then goes away, but how you operate. So when you're looking at a policy change, to look at it through the lens of how will this affect wellness? When you're looking at team building, to look at it through, as how Mindy just described, how do we build this team? Building teams, having trainings on how to deal with conflict. Those are all self-care and wellness components. The way I've come to think about it is that it's really about everything. It's about your lifestyle. It's about,
you want to sustain.
if you want to sustain, it's about looking at it through, okay, from everything from how much sleep am I getting, to what is my routine, to what habits, what is my environment, who am I associating with, who's toxic in my system. If I can't deal with them, or if I have to deal with them, how do I limit that? It's everything. It's the CEUs. It's the how do I integrate doing meetings, walking rather than sitting together. So it's really a lens as contrasted with something you do after you've done everything else.
So I know you guys have edited a whole book about self-care, and there's information on a blog on the New Social Worker website, and obviously you guys run workshops, and there's tons of information out there. So we can't cover it all as much as we might like to, but are there some take-home points that you would want listeners to leave the podcast knowing?
As someone who's been doing this for social work for a few decades, I would want us to leave with the perspective, or to really celebrate the perspective of the possibilities for self-care really changing the culture of our profession. And just to tell my own story, or to share my own journey with this. I am very passionate about this profession. I am still very dedicated to this profession. And I've been in situations that are toxic. And if you're in the profession, I guarantee that you will encounter that. It's just, unfortunately, at least at this point in our development as a profession, it's going to happen. And I can testify that practicing self-care and really investing in that, really being committed to that over the course of these several years or decades, has really been the factor that helps me sustain my passion and my joy in the profession. So it's not just about taking care of yourself after work, or taking care of yourself as an extra, but it really is about that integration and being an integral part of how we can sustain the passion for the work.
I think one of my take-home points, if there's one thing that you can get from this, is that it's small steps. You can do small things to change your environment and the way that you approach self-care. Just like the story that I told earlier about when I was on that child welfare team quite some time ago. We truly did affect outcomes, and I think it's because, we really started to connect with each other as practitioners. We got to know each other. We built up we did a lot of team building stuff, even though we didn't call it that, that helped us feel better internally, that connection to each other that then helped us better serve our clients. And so to understand that it's not just, something that, like Erlene said, that you do, after work, but it is something that allows you to truly enjoy your work and sustain long term. We need folks that stay in the profession, that love the profession, that believe in the work and have a positive approach. More years in, they become leadership, and they can do that with their teams. And then you never know, they can be the director of an organization, and then they can have that wellness perspective, on the work, thereby changing an entire organization. So I really do believe that small steps, can make long-term gains in self-care. Thanks.
I think I would just reiterate some earlier points in terms of for folks who are either in the profession or about to engage in the profession. that they take self-care seriously, that they understand that it is necessary to skillful work. And again, just as we engage in practice and in education and socialization around a multitude of different social work practice skills, we must also do the same thing with self-care and know that we've been doing it for a while and we don't always get it right. But that we continue to try and there's beauty in process, and sometimes process is product. So thinking about the fact that you are engaging in the process can sometimes be viewed as the outcome. So I would just implore folks to really reconceptualize the way that we begin to think about self-care, so that it becomes something that we would ask the question, why wouldn't you do self-care?
Well, and just one last thing. Do yoga.
That's awesome.
I say go sit on the porch. There you go.
Sitting.
Well, and as you can hear by the raucous laughter of these three people, that it really sounds like one of the things about self-care is connection. And that you guys have connected with each other, and that you've talked about multiple ways in which you've have self-care support, and that's something that seems like it's really essential. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us here at the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for your investment.
Thank you very much.
Hey there, it's me again. That was so much fun, wasn't it? Okay, klezmer music in just a second. As I said in the beginning, if you want a deeper dive into self-care, Erlene and Jay are doing a 2-part webinar for the new Social Worker magazine called Self-Care Well Shop, Foundations and Fundamentals on March 21st, 2018 and April 18th, 2018. The link is on socialworkpodcast.com. Okay, here's the klezmer music. I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.